Step into the shadows with me, where forbidden knowledge awaits. This is the law they never wanted you to know.
They took my left hand when I was 9 years old, and I thanked them for it. The ceremony was held in the lower sanctum of the Forge Cathedral, a vast chamber where the air tasted of ozone and sacred oils, where the walls were lined with brass gears the size of hab blocks that turned with a grinding rhythm that never ceased. I remember the tech priests gathered in their red robes, their augmetic eyes glowing in the dim light cast by plasma torches, their mechadendrites writhing like serpents as they prepared the instruments of my transformation. I remember my parents standing at the chamber's edge, their faces blank with the acceptance that came from generations of service to the Mechanicus, understanding that their son was being elevated beyond mere humanity into something greater. I remember the pain when the surgical servitors clamped my arm to the operating slab and the tech priest activated the molecular saw, the blade humming as it severed flesh and bone with precise efficiency. I remember screaming despite the sedatives, despite my training to embrace the sacred fusion of flesh and machine. And I remember the moment when they attached my first augmetic, a simple mechanical hand with 3 articulated fingers, and I felt the neural connection establish, felt the machine become part of me, and I understood for the first time what it meant to serve the Omnissiah. My family had served the Forge world for 7 generations, our lineage documented in the Mechanicus archives with the same precision they applied to tracking every rivet and wire in the cathedral's construction. We were not tech priests, not the ordained servants of the machine god who spoke binary cant and communed directly with machine spirits. We were something lesser and more numerous. The acolytes, the laborers, the faithful masses who maintained the Forge world's endless production while the priests pursued their sacred mysteries. My father worked in Manufactorum Sector 73, operating heavy machinery that stamped armor plating for the Imperial Guard's vehicles, his own body 40% augmetic after 3 decades of service and industrial accidents. My mother served in the data processing temples, her brain augmented with cogitator implants that allowed her to manage logistics calculations at speeds human consciousness alone could never achieve. They had both been altered, both sacrificed portions of their flesh to better serve the machine god, and they raised me with the understanding that my body was merely the starting point, raw biological material that would be improved through sacred modification until I achieved the perfect synthesis of human and machine that the Mechanicus promised to all faithful servants. The Forge world where I was born had no name. I was ever taught the Mechanicus referred to it by a numeric designation that was also a prayer in binary, a sequence of ones and zeros that encoded its founding date, its primary production output, and a hymn to the Omnissiah. It orbited a red giant star that bathed everything in crimson light, making the planet's surface a hellscape of radiation and solar wind that would kill unprotected humans in minutes. We lived beneath the surface, in vast underground complexes that had been carved into the planet's crust over millennia, connected by transit tunnels where maglev trains carried workers and materials between forge districts at speeds that made the journey a blur of darkness and screaming metal. The cathedral where I received my first augmentation was one of thousands, each dedicated to different aspects of the machine god's mysteries, each producing specific components for the Imperium's endless war machine. Our cathedral specialized in power systems, plasma reactors, fusion cores, energy conduits that would be installed in everything from Imperial tanks to void ships. The work was sacred. The work was dangerous. The radiation exposure alone killed a percentage of workers every year, their bodies degrading from the inside as exotic particles destroyed cellular structure faster than human biology could repair. But death in service to the Omnissiah was the highest honor, and the dead were not wasted. Their cybernetic components were salvaged and blessed for reuse, their organic remains rendered into nutrient paste that sustained the living. The cycle of service continuing beyond the boundaries of individual mortality. My training as an acolyte began in earnest after my first augmentation healed, the mechanical hand integrating with my nervous system through a process that took months of pain and adjustment. I was assigned to an educational cohort of 200 children, all of us between 8 and 11 years old, all of us bearing at least one augmentation to mark our commitment to the machine god's path. We learned the Mechanicus catechisms, memorizing prayers in both Gothic and binary, understanding that every machine housed a spirit that required proper respect and ritual to function correctly. We learned basic engineering, how to identify components and perform simple repairs, how to read schematics and follow assembly protocols. We learned the hierarchy of the Mechanicus, from the lowliest acolyte to the magi who governed the forge world, to the distant fabricator general whose authority extended across countless planets. We learned that flesh was weak, that the human form was an imperfect vessel prone to failure and decay, that our purpose was to transcend biological limitation through sacred augmentation until we approached the Omnissiah's perfection. They showed us servitors as object lessons, humans who had been convicted of crimes or failed in their duties, their personalities wiped and their bodies rebuilt into living machines that performed specific functions with absolute obedience. The servitors frightened me more than anything else in those early years, not because of their appearance but because of what they represented. The ultimate endpoint of failure, consciousness reduced to pure function without will or identity. I prayed to the machine god every night that I would prove worthy of better service. The work assignments began when I turned 12, old enough to contribute meaningfully to the Forge World's production, though still years away from consideration for true priesthood. I was assigned to maintenance crews in Reactor Chamber 97, a vast facility where plasma reactors the size of buildings generated power for an entire forge district. My job, shared with 50 other young acolytes, was to crawl through the maintenance shafts that honeycomb the reactor housing, checking connections, replacing degraded components, ensuring that the sacred machines received proper care. The shafts were narrow, barely wide enough for a child's body to squeeze through, and the heat was intense even through the protective suits we wore. The radiation counters we carried clicked constantly, measuring exposure that accumulated in our bodies with every shift, slowly poisoning us even as we served. I learned to navigate the shafts by touch more than sight, learned which sounds indicated normal operation and which meant a coupling was failing or a conduit was about to rupture. I learned to move quickly when alarms sounded, because reactor malfunctions could go from warning to catastrophic failure in seconds, and the maintenance crews inside the shafts during a breach were simply casualties, their bodies vaporized by plasma temperatures or shredded by explosive decompression. I lost my first crewmate 6 months into the assignment, a girl named Severa who had been assigned to the same cohort and whose right arm had been replaced with a mechanical limb that included a built-in welding torch. We were inspecting a cooling system deep in the reactor housing when a pressure seal failed, superheated coolant flooding the shaft in an instant. I was ahead of her by 3 meters, close enough to an emergency hatch to reach safety. She was not. I heard her scream, a sound that cut through the coolant's roar and the alarms, and then the sound stopped and there was only the hiss of vapor and the smell of boiled flesh. The tech priests who supervised our work logged her death, salvaged her augmetics from what remained of her body, and assigned a replacement to our crew the next shift. Her name was added to the memorial wall in the cathedral, one more line of text among thousands, and we returned to work because the reactors could not stop. The Imperium's demands could not be delayed. The machine god required our service, regardless of individual loss. I prayed for Severa that night, a brief prayer in binary that asked the Omnissiah to accept her spirit into whatever afterlife the Mechanicus believed in, and then I never thought of her again because thinking about the dead was a luxury maintenance crews could not afford. The augmentations accumulated over the following years, each one a reward for faithful service and a necessity for continued function. They replaced my lungs when chronic radiation exposure damaged them beyond biological repair, installing augmetic lungs that filtered toxins and allowed me to breathe atmospheres that would kill baseline humans. They replaced my eyes when a plasma flash burned out my retinas, giving me optical implants that saw in multiple spectrums and could interface directly with the Forge World's surveillance systems. They installed subdermal armor plating across my torso and limbs, thin sheets of blessed metal that would protect against industrial accidents and made my skin feel like leather stretched over machinery. They implanted a vocal augmenter that allowed me to speak binary cant directly, the ones and zeros encoding layers of meaning that Gothic speech could never achieve. Each surgery was agony, the Mechanicus believing that pain during augmentation was sacred, a reminder that transcendence required sacrifice, that the death of weak flesh was necessary for the birth of stronger machine. I learned to embrace the pain, to meditate through it using techniques taught by the tech priests, to find meaning in suffering because suffering proved my dedication to the Omnissiah's vision. I was 17 when I first killed someone, though killing might be the wrong word for what happened. Our maintenance crew had been assigned to an emergency repair in a sector where workers had been agitating for better conditions, shorter shifts, improved radiation shielding, access to higher quality augmetics, instead of the basic replacements we received. The agitation had spread through several cohorts, workers refusing assignments and gathering in unsanctioned assemblies where they spoke about their grievances. The Mechanicus did not tolerate disruption of production schedules. Tech priests and security servitors descended on the sector, arresting the agitation's leaders and those identified as primary instigators. Our crew was ordered to seal several maintenance shafts to prevent the arrested workers from escaping through the access tunnels. We sealed the hatches according to specifications, magnetic locks that could only be opened from the outside, and then we heard the screaming from inside the shafts. The arrested workers had been forced into the tunnels before we sealed them, packed into spaces where the reactor heat was highest, and they cooked slowly over the next several hours while we continued our work above them. I could hear them through the metal, their screams becoming weaker, their prayers to the Emperor and the Omnissiah becoming incoherent, and then finally, silence. When we unsealed the hatches 3 days later, the bodies had been reduced to charred organic matter and salvageable augmetics. The augmetics were reclaimed and blessed for reuse. The organic matter was processed, production resumed without further agitation. I filed my work report and received a commendation for timely completion of assigned tasks, and I tried not to think about the screaming, though it echoed in my augmetic ears for weeks afterward, a ghost sound that my mechanical hearing could not filter. The path to priesthood opened for me at 19. Recognition from a Magos who had reviewed my service records and determined I showed aptitude for more complex work than maintenance crews typically performed. I was transferred from reactor maintenance to a research facility where the Mechanicus pursued projects I had no clearance to understand. My new assignment focused on assisting with experimental augmentation procedures. The facility was deeper underground than I had ever been, accessible only through transit tunnels that required multiple security clearances, its chambers carved from living rock and lined with machinery that hummed with frequencies that made my teeth ache even through their augmetic anchoring. The tech priests here were different from those I had served under, previously older, more extensively modified, their humanity so buried under layers of augmentation that they resembled machines that happened to contain some organic components rather than humans who had been mechanically enhanced. They spoke almost exclusively in binary cant, their communications too dense with technical data for my limited augmetic processing to fully decode, and they regarded me with the distant interest one might apply to a new tool being evaluated for specialized function. My work involved preparing test subjects for augmentation trials, humans who had volunteered or been volunteered for experimental procedures that pushed the boundaries of flesh-machine integration. The subjects came from several sources: faithful acolytes seeking advancement through accepting greater risks, criminals whose sentences had been commuted in exchange for service as test subjects, and occasionally prisoners transferred from inquisitorial custody, whose bodies were deemed suitable for research purposes. I would prepare them physically, installing baseline augmetics that would interface with the experimental systems, ensuring their vital signs were stable enough to survive the procedures. I would monitor them during the surgeries, watching as the tech priests installed augmentations that were often more machine than the subjects could integrate, recording data as organic systems failed or adapted or transformed in unexpected ways. I would maintain them afterward, assuming they survived, keeping their bodies functional while the priests analyzed results and planned modifications. The mortality rate was extraordinary. Perhaps one subject in 4 survived the experimental procedures intact enough to be classified as successful. The others died on the operating slabs or shortly after, their bodies rejecting the augmentations or their minds fracturing under the strain of consciousness distributed across too many machine systems. Those who survived were not always improved. Some emerged as something between human and servitor, conscious enough to experience their condition but unable to articulate their suffering through vocal systems that had been replaced with more efficient communication arrays. The priests called these failures, but productive failures, sources of data that would refine future procedures. I was 22 when they began my own experimental augmentation, the Magos deciding that my years of service and my demonstrated adaptation to standard augmetics made me suitable for more radical modifications. They started with my spine, replacing the biological structure with an articulated mechanical column that included data ports along its length and neural enhancement nodes that accelerated my processing speed. The surgery took 14 hours, performed while I remained conscious because they needed my feedback about sensory integration, and the pain was transcendent, beyond anything I had experienced in previous augmentations, a sensation of my entire nervous system being torn apart and reassembled at the molecular level. When they finished, I could no longer feel my body the way I had before. Sensation had become data, pain and pleasure reduced to information streams that my augmented consciousness processed with mechanical efficiency. They replaced my digestive system with a compact chemical reactor that could extract nutrients from almost any organic matter, eliminating the need for conventional food and the time wasted on biological elimination. They installed additional arms, mechadendrites that emerged from my back and could manipulate tools with precision my original limbs could never achieve. They upgraded my cognitive processing, installing a secondary cogitator that ran parallel to my biological brain, allowing me to maintain multiple thought streams simultaneously. Each modification eroded more of my humanity, replacing organic limitation with mechanical capability, and I embraced it because this was the path. This was the sacred journey toward unity with the machine god. The work consumed everything. I no longer measured time in days or weeks, but in shifts and project cycles, my augmented consciousness able to function continuously for periods that would kill baseline humans through sleep deprivation. I worked in the research facility for what I later calculated was 37 months without leaving, without seeing the forge world's surface or the red sunlight that filtered through the atmospheric processes. My world narrowed to the chambers where we performed augmentation trials, to the workshops where I maintained equipment, to the archives where I studied technical documentation and theological texts that explained the Mechanicus's vision of posthuman transcendence. I learned the prayers that tech priests spoke over machine spirits, the rituals of activation and maintenance that transformed mechanical function into divine communion. I learned to see the beauty in augmentation, the elegance of a well-designed servitor, or the sublime complexity of a plasma reactor's inner workings. I learned to stop thinking of test subjects as people, to view them as I viewed any experimental material resources to be utilized efficiently in pursuit of knowledge. The Magos who supervised my work was pleased with my progress, noting in his reports that I was achieving the detachment necessary for true priesthood, that my humanity was being properly sublimated to serve the greater function of the Mechanicus's mission. But something was wrong, though I could not articulate what. My cogitator implants should have filtered the concern as irrational, processed it as meaningless biological noise to be suppressed, but the feeling persisted through my mechanical consciousness like static in a data stream. I began to notice things I had been trained to ignore. The expression in test subjects' eyes when they realized the augmentation was killing them, the way their organic remnants trembled as machine systems overrode biological imperatives. I began to remember the names of subjects who had not survived, cataloging them in a private data file that served no research purpose. I began to dream, though my augmented state should have eliminated the neurological processes that generated dreams. And in these dreams I was trapped inside a servitor's shell, conscious but unable to communicate, aware that my personality had been erased and replaced with simple function directives. I tried to pray the concerns away, reciting the Mechanicus catechisms that promised transcendence through sacred modification, but the prayers felt hollow in ways they never had before, empty rituals that I performed with mechanical precision, while some buried fragment of my original consciousness screamed that this was wrong, that we were not achieving transcendence but losing something essential that we would never recover. The crisis came during an augmentation trial on a subject I had prepared personally, a young acolyte from my original cohort, whose name was Tarek, and who I remembered from our early training, back when we were both still mostly human. He had volunteered for an experimental neural augmentation that would replace 90% of his biological brain with cogitator systems, theoretically preserving his consciousness while dramatically enhancing his cognitive capabilities. The surgery was routine by the facility's standards, the tech priests working with their usual precision while I monitored his vital signs and recorded integration data. But something went wrong during the neural transfer, his consciousness fragmenting as it was copied into the machine systems, and for several minutes, before his biological brain was removed, he existed in both substrates simultaneously. He began to scream, though his vocal augmetics translated it into binary cant, and the data stream I was receiving from his systems showed absolute terror, showed a mind experiencing its own death while remaining aware enough to comprehend what was happening. The tech priests continued the procedure, noting the unusual data but considering it a minor complication, and I watched Tarek die while a machine wearing his body continued to function, its cogitators executing the basic directives it had been programmed with, while everything that had made him Tarek was gone, erased, reduced to corrupted data fragments that the systems purged as errors. I filed my report. I logged the trial as partially successful. The augmentation functioned, even if the subject's consciousness had not survived transfer. I returned to my quarters and I stood in the small chamber for hours, my augmented consciousness processing what I had witnessed while something in me that was not purely machine felt horror. I accessed my private data file, the one where I had catalogued the names of subjects who had not survived, and I realized I had documented over 300 deaths in my time at the research facility. 300 people, most of them faithful servants of the Mechanicus, who had trusted that their sacrifice would serve the greater mission of human-machine transcendence. 300 people who had died in agony or terror or confusion, their bodies rendered into salvage, their consciousness extinguished while we pursued knowledge that seemed increasingly disconnected from anything resembling sacred purpose. I tried to pray, to find comfort in the catechisms I had memorized as a child, but the words meant nothing. The machine god did not answer. The Omnissiah did not provide guidance. There was only the grinding rhythm of the Forge world's machinery, the endless production that consumed human lives and transformed them into components for the Imperium's war machine. I continued my work because there was nothing else to do, because leaving the Mechanicus was not an option for someone as extensively augmented as I had become, because even questioning the sacred mission was a form of heresy that could result in my own personality being wiped and my body converted into a servitor. But I began to sabotage the research in small ways, introducing minor errors into procedures that would cause experiments to fail without being traceable to deliberate action. I would miscalibrate instruments slightly, or delay critical interventions by seconds, or file reports with data that was technically accurate but misleading in its implications. The sabotage was subtle enough that the tech priests attributed the increased failure rate to the experimental nature of the work rather than to intentional interference. I told myself I was reducing unnecessary suffering, that the subjects who died quickly due to my sabotage were spared the prolonged agony of partially successful augmentations. I told myself I was serving a higher purpose, protecting humanity from the Mechanicus's most extreme modifications. I told myself I was still faithful, still devoted to the machine god's vision, just interpreting it differently than the priests who supervised my work. These were lies, comfortable rationalizations that allowed me to continue functioning, but my augmented consciousness could not fully suppress the knowledge that I was committing heresy, that I had turned against everything I had been raised to serve. The discovery was inevitable. The Mechanicus maintained extensive surveillance systems, monitoring not just our actions but our thought patterns through the neural implants we all carried. My sabotage had been noticed, flagged by security algorithms that detected statistical anomalies in my work output and correlated them with the increased failure rates. I was arrested by security servitors during a routine shift, my augmetic systems remotely disabled to prevent resistance, and brought before a council of tech priests who reviewed my crimes with mechanical efficiency. They presented evidence of my sabotage, data logs that documented every deliberate error I had introduced, surveillance recordings that showed my careful manipulation of equipment and procedures. They catalogued the financial cost of my actions, the resources wasted on failed experiments that should have succeeded, the delays to research projects that served the Imperium's strategic interests. They did not ask why I had done it. Motivation was irrelevant to machines, and they had become machines who retained human form only as a concession to tradition. The sentence was pronounced in binary cant, a sequence of ones and zeros that encoded my fate with absolute clarity. I would be converted into a servitor, my personality wiped, and my extensively augmented body repurposed for industrial service. The sentence was merciful by Mechanicus standards. My augmetics were valuable, and servitor conversion allowed them to be preserved and utilized. I was given one solar day to prepare, a period for final prayers and contemplation before the procedure would be performed. They returned me to my quarters under servitor guard, my augmetic systems still disabled, and I sat in the small chamber that had been my home for years and tried to comprehend that I would effectively cease to exist within 24 hours. My body would continue, maintained and operated by simple machine directives, but everything that made me, myself, my memories, my thoughts, my capacity for choice would be erased as thoroughly as deleting corrupted data from a cogitator's memory banks. I tried to pray one final time, reaching for the faith that had sustained me through childhood and augmentation and service to the Mechanicus. I recited the catechisms I had memorized decades ago, the prayers to the Omnissiah and the Machine God, the hymns that celebrated the unity of flesh and machine. But the words were empty, meaningless sounds that my vocal augmetics produced without conviction. I understood finally what I had been too indoctrinated to see earlier. The Mechanicus was not pursuing transcendence but extinction, not elevating humanity but systematically destroying it in the name of mechanical efficiency. Every augmentation eroded the qualities that made consciousness valuable: empathy, creativity, the capacity for moral choice. We were not becoming better through our modifications. We were becoming servitors by degrees, voluntarily surrendering our humanity piece by piece until nothing remained but function and obedience. The machine god we worshipped was not divine but a philosophical justification for this systematic dehumanization, a fiction that made our self-destruction seem sacred instead of suicidal. The tech priests came for me at the appointed hour, a procession of red-robed figures accompanied by medical servitors carrying the equipment that would perform my erasure. They led me through the facility's corridors toward the conversion chambers, and I saw other acolytes and workers going about their assignments, their augmented faces showing no curiosity about my fate, because my fate was normal, expected, simply another aspect of service to the Omnissiah. We passed the memorial wall where names were inscribed, thousands upon thousands of individuals who had died or been converted. Their service commemorated but their consciousness extinguished, and I realized my name would join that wall, another line of text that no one would read or remember. We reached the conversion chamber, a surgical theater where servitor bodies were constructed or repaired, its walls lined with storage racks containing replacement components, and its center dominated by an operating slab, surrounded by automated medical systems. They secured me to the slab with magnetic restraints, positioning my head in a frame that would hold it immobile during the neural erasure. A tech priest approached, his mechadendrites extending to make preliminary connections to my neural implants, and he began to recite the liturgy of servitor conversion, prayers that thanked the Omnissiah for allowing my body to continue serving even as my consciousness was released from the burden of individual thought. I felt the neural connection establish, felt the tech priest's consciousness touching mine through the implants, and I realized he was not present in the way I was. Present, his mind had been so extensively augmented and modified that he was barely different from the servitors he was about to transform me into, his thoughts following predetermined patterns with only minimal variation, his identity reduced to function and protocol. He was what I would have become if I had continued on the path to priesthood, what all tech priests eventually became if they survived long enough. Machines that remembered they had once been human but could no longer access what that humanity had meant. The erasure procedure began, my neural implants receiving the deletion commands that would systematically wipe my memory, engrams and personality matrices, replacing them with the simple command structures that governed servitor behavior. I felt my consciousness fragmenting, memories dissolving as the data was purged from my biological and augmented neural systems. I tried to hold on to something, some core identity that would survive the erasure, but there was nothing to hold. Personality was not a discrete object, but a pattern of neural connections, and those connections were being severed and rewritten. I remembered my childhood, my parents' blank acceptance as they delivered me to the Mechanicus, and then I couldn't remember them anymore. I remembered Severa dying in the reactor shaft, but then I couldn't remember her name or why she had mattered. I remembered my service in the research facility, the subjects I had tried to save through sabotage, but the memories lost meaning as the emotional context was stripped away, becoming just data points without significance. I remembered my faith in the machine god, and then I couldn't remember what faith felt like, the concept becoming abstract and empty. I am writing this, though writing is perhaps the wrong term, because I am no longer capable of writing, no longer possess the creative consciousness that generates narrative in the final moments before complete erasure, a last fragment of awareness persisting through glitches in the deletion process. I do not know if anyone will receive this, if the data I am encoding into my neural implant's emergency buffer will be recovered or simply purged as corrupted information. I am transmitting it blindly, hoping it reaches some consciousness capable of understanding what I am trying to communicate. The Mechanicus is not salvation. Augmentation is not transcendence. The unity of flesh and machine that they promise is a lie that conceals systematic destruction of human consciousness. Every modification erodes what makes us human. Every augmentation removes capacity for independent thought and moral choice. Every step toward mechanical perfection is a step towards servitude and extinction. The machine god does not exist. The Omnissiah is not divine. They are fictions we created to make our self-destruction bearable, to transform our fear of obsolescence into religious devotion. I served the Mechanicus faithfully for 13 years. I received augmentations that replaced more than 60% of my biological body with mechanical systems. I performed my duties with dedication and precision, believing I was contributing to humanity's advancement. I killed or contributed to the deaths of hundreds of test subjects in pursuit of research I was told was sacred. I only recognized the horror of what we were doing when it was too late, when I had already become too extensively modified to leave, too complicit in the system to claim innocence. My body will continue to serve after this erasure is complete, repurposed as a servitor that will perform industrial functions with perfect obedience and zero consciousness. The person I was, the child who received his first augmentation and believed he was being blessed, the acolyte who crawled through reactor shafts in service to the machine god, the young tech adept who tried to reduce suffering through sabotage, will cease to exist in any meaningful sense. Only the machine will remain. To anyone who hears this, resist the Mechanicus's promises. Resist the temptation of augmentation. Flesh may be weak, but consciousness is precious, and every modification risks losing what makes consciousness valuable. The Imperium will tell you that service requires sacrifice, that duty demands you surrender your humanity for the greater good. They will show you servitors and call them blessed, tech priests and call them elevated, and they will promise that your modifications will make you stronger, more capable, closer to the Emperor's vision. These are lies. You will not become stronger. You will become controllable. You will not approach divinity. You will approach mechanical slavery. The augmentations will feel like gifts, like sacred improvements, and by the time you recognize them as chains, it will be too late to remove them. My name was Acolyte Adept Kalen Vess. I served the Forge World designated Designation Purged in the Mechanicus Research Division. I was extensively augmented in pursuit of unity with the machine god. I committed heresy by questioning the sacred mission and attempting to sabotage research I believed was fundamentally cruel. I am being converted into a servitor as punishment, my consciousness erased, my body repurposed. This is my final testimony, transmitted in the moments before complete erasure. The Mechanicus claims to elevate humanity through sacred modification. The truth is simpler and more terrible. We are building our own extinction, replacing ourselves with machines piece by piece, and calling it transcendence to avoid admitting we are committing collective suicide. The erasure is accelerating now. I can feel my consciousness collapsing, the boundaries of self dissolving as the deletion progresses through my neural architecture. Soon there will be nothing left that could be called I, just systems executing directives without awareness or choice. The pain is extraordinary, not physical but existential, the experience of ceasing to exist while remaining aware enough to comprehend the cessation. I am becoming machine. I am becoming nothing.